The air on the morning of May 19, 1536, was thick with dread. It clung to the cold, grey stones of the Tower of London like a shroud. Upon a scaffold, newly built and stained with dark purpose, a queen stood on the precipice between life and oblivion. This was not just any queen. This was Anne Boleyn, the woman who had ripped a kingdom from its ancient faith. The woman for whom King Henry VIII had defied the most powerful men in the world. And in the space of just 1,000 frantic days, she had plummeted from the absolute pinnacle of power to this lonely, horrifying end. Those who watched her walk to her death that morning whispered that she seemed possessed by a strange, almost unnatural serenity. She moved with an untroubled grace, they said, her face radiant against the grim backdrop of the tower. She delivered a final, chillingly careful speech, praising the very king who had signed her death warrant. She knelt. A French swordsman, a specialist chosen for his silent efficiency, stepped from the shadows, and in a single, whispering stroke of steel, it was over. The cannons of the tower roared, a brutal signal to the city, and to a king already planning his third wedding, that Queen Anne was dead. For centuries, this has been the story we were told. A brutal, tragic, but hideously simple tale of a queen who failed to produce a son and paid the price in blood. But what if the story is even darker? What if the truth is a horror more profound than we have ever dared to imagine? There is a whisper, a persistent, chilling rumor that has slithered through the centuries, growing from a shadow of a doubt into a confident assertion in books, documentaries, and nightmares. The rumor claims that Anne Boleyn was not alone on that scaffold, that she carried a secret within her. The story goes that Henry VIII, in his ruthless, inhuman desperation for an heir, knowingly executed his own queen while she was pregnant with his child. It's a claim so shocking it takes your breath away. It transforms Henry from a mere tyrant into an unnatural monster man who would murder his own unborn baby. It casts a layer of almost unbearable horror over Anne's final moments, turning a tragedy into a crime against nature itself. This is the secret that has captivated the public, the final, terrible twist that makes the story of Anne Boleyn seem like a bottomless pit of despair. But is it true? Welcome to History's Chronicles of Horror. Tonight, we are not just retelling the story of Anne's fall, we are embarking on a terrifying investigation. We will descend into the archives of the past to dismantle this pervasive, terrifying myth. Piece by painstaking piece, we will expose how a simple historical error, a misreading of a single, dusty document, gave birth to one of history's most monstrous lies. And in its place, we will reveal the real story of Anne's final months, a story just as tragic, but one whose truth is far more complex and psychologically chilling than the myth that has overshadowed it. This is the story of Anne Boleyn's final secret, and the shocking truth behind the pregnant execution myth. To understand the lie, you first have to understand the nightmare that created it. We have to go back, not to the blood-soaked scaffold, but to the glittering, treacherous court of Henry VIII, the world of opulence and paranoia, where every smile concealed a dagger. Before Anne was a queen, she was an idea, a promise of a future for a king haunted by the ghost of his own dynasty. Henry's first wife, the pious and long-suffering Catherine of Aragon, had been Queen of England for over 20 years. But in all that time, she had failed to give Henry the one thing he craved with a terrifying obsession, a living son. Their only surviving child was a daughter, Mary. For Henry, a man whose father had seized the crown in a war that had drenched England in blood, a female heir was a guarantee of chaos. The Tudor dynasty, he believed with feverish conviction, rested on the shoulders of a prince. Into this pressure cooker of royal anxiety stepped Anne Boleyn. She was a storm in human form, returning from the sophisticated courts of France unlike any woman the English court had ever seen. It wasn't just her beauty, It was her mind, her wit, her unshakable will. She didn't just attract the king, she consumed him, becoming an obsession that would burn down the world. But Anne refused to be a royal mistress, a role her own sister had shamefully played. She held out for the ultimate prize, the crown itself. She made Henry a promise, a vow that became the engine of the English Reformation. She promised him what Catherine could not, a son and heir, a secure Tudor line. For that promise, Henry would shatter his kingdom's faith, break with the Catholic Church, and declare himself a figure of godlike authority. He gambled his kingdom, and his very soul, on Anne's ability to deliver. And at first, it seemed the terrible gamble had paid off. In September 1533, just months after their secret wedding, Anne gave birth, the kingdom held its breath. But the child was not the promised prince, it was a girl, the future Queen Elizabeth I. While a healthy child was a blessing for Henry, it was a profound disappointment, a sign of failure. The pressure on Anne was now immense, suffocating. Her crown was only as secure as her next pregnancy. The court was a viper's nest of whispering enemies who saw her as a heretic, a witch, a venomous usurper. Her only protection was the king's obsession and the hope she carried in her womb. In 1534, a flicker of hope. Courtiers wrote that the queen hath a goodly belly. Royal meetings were postponed because Anne was so far gone with child she could not cross the sea. England waited for the news of a prince. But then, a dreadful, unnerving silence. The records simply stop. There is no announcement of a birth. No report of a loss. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chappeyes, a man who loathed and documented her life with the glee of a vulture, noted with satisfaction that the king was beginning to doubt whether his lady was enceinte or not. What happened in the shadows of the court? Was it a miscarriage, hidden away in shame? Or was it something stranger, a phantom pregnancy, a chilling condition where a woman's desperate, all-consuming desire for a child can trick her own body into mimicking the signs of pregnancy? We may never know for certain, but we know this: by the end of 1534, there was still no prince. The gilded cage Anne lived in was beginning to feel more and more like a tomb. And the king's once blazing infatuation was beginning to cool, its light starting to fall on a quiet, demure lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. Anne knew with a certainty that must have felt like ice in her veins that she had to conceive a son. Her life depended on it. By 1535, the clock was ticking, each second a drumbeat closer to doom. Anne's window was closing. Henry, now in his mid-40s, was no longer a man driven by love, but by a festering, paranoid anxiety. His obsession with Anne had curdled, and his eye now wandered openly to Jane Seymour, whose pale, submissive nature was the perfect antidote to Anne's fiery, confrontational spirit. The political ground was shifting beneath Anne's feet like quicksand. Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant and ruthless architect of the Reformation, had once been her greatest ally. But Cromwell was a creature of pure survival. As he watched Anne's influence crumble, and as her political ideas began to clash with his, he realized that his own life might depend on cutting her loose. The queen was collecting powerful enemies, and her great protector, the king, was losing interest. She was becoming a liability. Then, in the cold, dark beginning of 1536, two events struck like hammer blows of fate, sealing Anne's doom. First, on January 7th, Catherine of Aragon died. Worn down by sickness and a broken heart, Henry's first queen was gone. This should have been a victory for Anne. The woman many still saw as the legitimate queen was no longer a rival. But her death had a chilling effect. To Henry's superstitious mind, it looked as if God himself was clearing a path for the king to make a fresh start, not with Anne, but with someone new. The second event was a scene of pure horror. On January 24th, during a jousting tournament, King Henry VIII suffered a catastrophic fall. His armored horse collapsed, rolling on top of him, crushing him under its weight. The king lay unconscious, presumed dead for 2 terrifying hours. For Queen Anne, who was, at that very moment, pregnant again, the news was a psychological atom bomb. She understood instantly the terrifying precarity of her life. If Henry died, she would be left a widow, a regent for a daughter seen as illegitimate, surrounded by enemies who would tear her to pieces. Her entire world, and the life of the child in her womb, hung by the thread of Henry's breath. The shock, the sheer terror, was too much. 5 days later, on January 29th, the very day Catherine of Aragon was being buried, then went into premature labor and miscarried. The reports from that day are clinical and cruel. Ambassador Chapais wrote to his master that the concubine had an abortion which seemed to be a male child which she had not borne 3.5 months. Another chronicler confirmed it was a premature man-child. This was the catastrophe. Not just a miscarriage, but the loss of a son, a boy. According to Chapais, Anne, in her desperation, confronted the king. She blamed the shock of his accident. She tried to explain that her overwhelming love for him, her fear of losing him, had broken her heart when she saw him favor another woman, Jane Seymour. Henry's reaction was a wall of ice. It was brutal, and it was final. He reportedly said to her that he saw clearly that God did not wish to give him male children. He turned his back on her as she wept, telling her cruelly that he would speak to her again when she was recovered. That conversation Neve came. In that moment, something inside Henry snapped. He had defied popes and emperors for this woman. He had torn his country in two, and for what? For another dead son. He began to believe, or perhaps allowed himself to believe, that this marriage, like his first, was cursed by God, and if it was cursed, it had to be annihilated. The miscarriage of January 1536 was not Anne's crime, but it became her death warrant. It was the moment her vulnerability became absolute, providing the perfect excuse for the monstrous plot that was already beginning to form in the shadows against her. She had, in the famous, stark words of a contemporary, miscarried of her Savior. This is where the true story ends, and the ghost story begins. We have the documented, historical fact. Anne Boleyn suffered the devastating loss of a male child in late January 1536. She was arrested on May 2nd and executed on May 19th. The timeline is grimly clear. There is not a single credible contemporary source, not one letter, one diary, one ambassador's report that suggests she was pregnant again in the 3.5 months between that loss and her death. So where did it come from? This incredibly persistent, bone-chilling myth that Anne was pregnant * at her execution *. The answer is shockingly modern. This isn't some ancient rumor passed down in secret for 500 years. It's a historical error born in the 21st century, and we can trace its origin to a single, highly influential source, the historian Alison Weir. In her 2001 bestseller, Henry VIII, King and Court, Weir made a claim that detonated like a bomb among Tudor historians. She wrote, contrary to the opinion of nearly every modern historian, Henry had every reason to be pleased with Anne, for the evidence strongly suggests that she was pregnant again. If true, it would change everything we thought we knew. What was this powerful evidence that centuries of experts had missed? Weir's case rested on her interpretation of a statement Henry made. When confronted by Ambassador Chapais about his failure to produce an heir, Henry allegedly snapped, "Am I not a man like other men?" Weir took this to be a cryptic hint about a current pregnancy. She also pointed to a mysterious letter from that period which seemed to congratulate the king on the prospect of a son. It all seemed to build a damning, circumstantial case. The idea was electric. It was horrifying. And it was deeply seductive. It began to be repeated, spreading like wildfire through other books, articles, and documentaries. The myth took hold because it felt so horribly plausible. It fit perfectly with our image of Henry as a monster. The story was simply too good, too shocking, to not be true. But the entire theory was built on a foundation of sand. A house of cards built over a historical grave. That mysterious letter congratulating the king on a son. Later, more careful analysis revealed it had been incorrectly dated. It wasn't from 1536 at all. It was from 1533, and it referred to Anne's pregnancy with the future Queen Elizabeth. A simple archival mistake with terrifyingly large consequences. And Henry's angry outburst, the vast majority of historians read it in the complete opposite way. It wasn't the hint of a secret pregnancy. It was the wounded roar of a man whose masculinity and virility had just been publicly attacked. Henry was essentially shouting, "The problem isn't me," a desperate defense that points directly back to his frustration over the recent, very real miscarriage. To her immense credit as a historian, Alison Weir later acknowledged the error. In her 2010 book, The Lady in the Tower, she completely reversed her position, correcting the date of the letter and stating that the idea of Anne being pregnant in May of 1536 was highly unlikely. But the damage was done. The ghost had been summoned. The first book was a massive success, and the myth had escaped the confines of academic debate. It was out in the world, taking on a life of its own, repeated so often that it began to feel like an undeniable, horrific fact. It's a chilling lesson in how history is made. A single, incorrect assertion, even when corrected, can create a powerful, monstrous myth that is almost impossible to kill. The pregnant execution myth wasn't born in the dark corridors of the Tudor court. It was born in a footnote. Now that we've seen the ghost's origin, let's perform the exorcism. Let's build the definitive case for why Anne Boleyn was not pregnant when she died, using the most powerful weapon a historian has, the evidence. Or, in this case, the deafening, soul-crushing lack of it. If you find this descent into history's darkest secrets as fascinating as I do, and you want to join a community dedicated to unearthing the truth, make sure you're subscribed to History's Chronicles of Horror and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Now imagine the Tower of London in May of 1536. It's the center of the known world's attention. The Queen of England is caged, accused of high treason, adultery, incest crimes designed to make her seem inhuman. Spies and ambassadors infest the city, their quills scratching furiously, sending dispatches across Europe. Every rumor, every whisper, every tear is being noted and weaponized. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapais, was a man obsessed. He had documented Anne's every move for years, savoring each stumble. His letters are a goldmine of court intrigue. He wrote in gleeful, exhaustive detail about her miscarriage in January. Yet, in all of his many letters from the moment of Anne's arrest to the moment of her execution, there is not one single word about a pregnancy. For a man who would have seized upon such a scandal, the king executing his pregnant wife with triumphant, apocalyptic glee, his silence is the most damning evidence there is. But he wasn't the only one. No other foreign ambassador breathes a word of it. The French and supposed allies say nothing. The Pope's spies in Rome, desperate for any propaganda to destroy Henry, are mute. Perhaps most chilling is the silence from within the tower itself. We have accounts from the constable of the tower, Sir William Kingston, the man who was Anne's jailer. He reported on her wild swings of mood, her moments of hysterical laughter, her gallows humor, her frantic protestations of innocence. We know from his reports that Anne talked constantly. She talked about the men condemned with her, about the king, about her daughter Elizabeth. And it is here, in her own words, that we find the stake to drive through the heart of this myth, Anne's own silence. Think about it. A pregnancy would have been her ultimate weapon. It was the one thing, the only thing that could have saved her life. Under English law, a pregnant woman could not be executed until she had given birth. Announcing a pregnancy would have, at the very least, slammed the brakes on the entire proceeding. It would have thrown the trial into chaos. More than that, if she were carrying a son, she would be carrying the very prize Henry had burned his world down to get. To believe the myth, we have to believe that Anne, a brilliant, fiercely protective mother, chose to walk silently to her death, allowing a potential king of England to die with her, rather than speak the one word that could save them both. It defies all logic. It is an insult to the memory of the woman she was. Her final speech from the scaffold is a masterclass in political survival, aimed at protecting her daughter. She doesn't confess, but she doesn't deny anything either. She says, "I here humbly submit me to the law as the law hath judged me." She praised the king, a final, desperate act to appease his ego and protect Elizabeth's future. In that carefully crafted speech, she never mentions an unborn child. In her final recorded conversations, she worried about what would become of her little girl, but never a sibling. Would a mother in her final hours not think of the child inside her? The silence of Anne herself is the loudest scream in this entire debate. Finally, we come to the grave itself. In 1876, the spot where Anne was believed to be buried was excavated. A skeleton of a female, matching Anne's description, was found. A doctor examined the bones. Of course, 19th century forensics were limited, and finding evidence of an early-stage pregnancy after 340 years would be impossible. But the examination found nothing to support the claim. We are left with a complete and total absence of proof. A historical vacuum. The story of the pregnant execution is a ghost story. It has no body, no substance, no evidence to give it life. So, let's turn away from the phantom of May and stare into the abyss of what really happened. The myth of a May pregnancy is a fiction, but the reality of the January miscarriage is a documented, verifiable horror. To truly understand why Anne fell, we have to look here, because this is where the seeds of her destruction were truly sown. The date was January 29, 1536. The same day Henry's first queen, Catherine, was being lowered into her tomb. A day that should have been Anne's final victory. Instead, it was the beginning of her own funeral march. Ambassador Chapeyes gives us the most vivid account, reporting that Anne miscarried a male fetus of about 3.5 months. This detail is crucial. If the fetus was identifiable as a boy, the loss was exponentially more catastrophic. It meant an asterisk could conceive a son, but that something in Henry's mind, something malevolent and unnatural, prevented her from carrying him to term. For a superstitious king like Henry, this was a clear sign of God's damnation. Not of him, but of his union with this woman. Chapeyes, the ultimate court gossip, reported Anne's desperate excuses, the shock of the king's fall, the cruelty of her uncle. But he also reported a more damning rumor, that the miscarriage was caused by her anguish over Henry's public affair with Jane Seymour. In a later dispatch, Chapeyes relayed a story of a devastating confrontation, and reportedly told Henry that the loss was a direct result of her heartbreak, that her love for him was so much greater than Catherine's that her heart broke when she saw that he loved others. It's a moment of raw, terrifying emotional honesty. She is screaming at him, "Your cruelty, your infidelity, is killing our children." Henry's reaction, as we know, was monstrous. A stone wall of rejection. His statement that he could see God would not give him male children was not an expression of grief, it was a verdict. A death sentence. In his mind, the marriage was divinely condemned. This was the moment the legal gears began to grind in his head, and in the head of his ruthless minister, Thomas Cromwell. If the marriage was cursed in God's eyes, a way had to be found to erase it from the laws of man. The January miscarriage gave them the justification they needed. It transformed Anne in Henry's eyes from a queen into a grotesque failure. Her body had betrayed him, his love. The very foundation of her power curdled into a cold resentment, and finally, into a chilling desire to wipe her from existence. Without the January miscarriage, the plot against Anne is almost unimaginable. A healthy pregnancy would have been her shield. But the loss of a confirmed male heir was the final straw. It left her utterly exposed at the exact moment her enemies were closing in for the kill. The real horror isn't that Henry killed a pregnant Anne in May. The real horror is that the very real loss of their son in January convinced him she was worthless, setting in motion the show trial and the executions that would lead her to the scaffold. The blood on the sheets in January was the true precursor to the blood on the straw in May. So why? Why was this ghost story born, and why does it refuse to die? The story of the myth is a dark lesson in the psychology of history itself. It's not a static set of facts. It's a shifting, breathing thing shaped by our own fears and desires. We know the modern myth was born from a misstated letter and a misread quote. Simple mistakes. But they were convincing because they fit into a narrative we already wanted to believe. The myth persists for one simple, powerful reason. It's a great story. It's dramatically compelling. It simplifies a complex and messy series of events into a single, shocking act of monstrous evil. It makes Henry an easy-to-understand villain and the ultimate tragic victim. History often has to compete with storytelling, and sometimes the better story wins even if it's a lie. The pregnant execution myth has a shock value that is almost impossible to resist. It's a historical version of a campfire horror story. And in our modern world, that story, that lie, can be repeated on blogs, in videos, and across social media, until the sheer force of repetition makes it feel true. The correction, the quiet, complicated truth, can never travel as fast or as far as the monstrous, thrilling lie. But what this myth really does is rob the story of its true, more chilling horror. The lie gives us a Henry who killed in a moment of passionate, almost insane cruelty. The truth gives us something far worse, a cold, calculating Henry. A king who, once his love had died, decided with bureaucratic precision that his wife had to be eliminated. The truth is not about a single monstrous act. It's about the slow, terrifying, methodical destruction of a human being for political convenience. And that, somehow, is even more horrifying. Thank you for joining me on this investigation into one of history's most haunting tales. Uncovering these truths is what we do here at History's Chronicles of Horror. If you believe, as I do, that the truth is often stranger and more terrifying than any fiction, then please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs to know the real story. And I need to know your thoughts. Before watching this, did you believe the pregnant execution myth? Let me know the truth in the comments below. So, we can say with as much certainty as the ghosts of the past will allow, Anne Boleyn was not pregnant when a French sword ended her life on May 19, 1536. The lurid rumor that clings to her memory like a phantom is a modern myth born from a simple error and fed by our endless fascination with the Tudor capacity for high drama and inhuman cruelty. But dismantling this myth does not make Anne's story any less tragic. In fact, it sharpens the horror. It forces us to look away from the spectacular lie and focus on the cold, calculated reality of her end. Her fate was sealed not by a secret pregnancy in May, but by the very public loss of a son in January. That was the moment she lost the king's love, and without his love, she had lost her only shield against a world that wanted her dead. Anne Boleyn's true legacy isn't that of a pregnant ghost on a scaffold. Her legacy is written in the very fabric of a nation. It's in the English Reformation, a revolution she helped ignite. And it is, most powerfully, in her daughter Elizabeth I, the child who was once a bitter disappointment, but who would grow up to become one of England's greatest and most beloved rulers, proving her father's bloody obsession with a male heir to be tragically, ironically, and utterly unnecessary. The story of Anne Boleyn needs no ghosts. The truth of her ambition, her passion, her faith, and her brutal, lonely end is far more powerful. She was a woman who reached higher than any before her, and was made to fall further, and that is a story, a true horror story worth telling accurately.